some noise if you are excited for semifinal action.
A television executive just compared the most talked about athlete in women's sports to an illegal substance. And she meant it as a compliment. That sentence alone tells you everything about where women's basketball stands right now, caught between unprecedented visibility and the uncomfortable reality that even its biggest champions still struggle to articulate its value without controversy. Susie Piotrkowski, ESPN's vice president of women's sports programming, stood on a stage in Nashville last week and called Caitlin Clark a gateway drug. The crowd didn't gasp. They nodded. Because somehow, in 2024, comparing a generational talent to narcotics became acceptable shorthand for her impact on an entire league. But here's what nobody in that room said out loud. What if the drug metaphor is more accurate than anyone wants to admit? What if the WNBA's sudden surge isn't growth at all, but dependency? What if the league built its biggest season ever on a foundation that could crumble the moment one player's knee buckles wrong on a Tuesday night in Phoenix? This is that story. By the end of this, you'll understand why ESPN's most powerful programming executive chose the most provocative possible metaphor to describe a basketball player, why the WNBA's record-breaking ratings actually terrify the people running the league, and the one statistic from July 2024 that nobody wants to talk about because it reveals whether Caitlin Clark is saving women's basketball or exposing its most dangerous vulnerability. This video requires your full attention because the surface narrative, the one about a popular player growing the game, is a carefully constructed illusion. The real story underneath involves billions of dollars, institutional panic, and a league gambling its entire future on a bet that mathematics says it should lose. The WNBA entered 2024 with a simple problem. After 28 years of existence, the league had never cracked mainstream consciousness in any sustainable way. Not during the dynasty years when the Houston Comets won 4 straight championships. Not when Lisa Leslie became the first woman to dunk in a professional game. Not when Diana Taurasi accumulated more points than any player in league history. The formula never changed. A transcendent moment would capture brief national attention. Casual viewers would tune in expecting the NBA with different players, and within weeks the audience would evaporate like morning fog. Television ratings told the brutal truth. The average WNBA game in 2023 drew fewer than 500,000 viewers. NFL preseason games, exhibitions where star players sit out and third-string quarterbacks fight for roster spots, regularly tripled that number. The league survived on institutional subsidies from the NBA, on the loyalty of a small but devoted fan base, on the stubborn belief that eventually America would recognize what it had been missing. Then Caitlin Clark happened. Not slowly, not gradually. Overnight, the calculus changed completely. Her final college season at Iowa shattered every assumption about what women's basketball could achieve commercially. The 2024 national championship game between Iowa and South Carolina drew nearly 19 million viewers. More than any NBA Finals game that year. More than most World Series contests. More than anything the WNBA had ever imagined possible for its own product. And the question became immediate, urgent, and existentially loaded. What happens when she goes pro? The Indiana Fever selected Clark with the first overall pick in April 2024, and the league held its breath. Everything accelerated beyond projection. Her first regular season game drew over 2 million viewers, quadrupling typical WNBA numbers. Arenas that had played to half-empty crowds suddenly sold out weeks in advance. Ticket prices on secondary markets exceeded $300 for regular season contests. Merchandise sales exploded. Social media engagement metrics broke tracking systems. The numbers looked less like organic growth and more like a controlled explosion. ESPN noticed. How could they not? The network had invested heavily in women's sports rights, betting that the market would eventually materialize. Suddenly that bet was paying off beyond any reasonable forecast. Piotrkowski's programming team scrambled to adjust. They moved games to better time slots. They expanded studio coverage. They built promotional campaigns around a single player in ways the league had never experienced. And in Nashville, standing before an industry audience hungry for insight, Piotrkowski reached for the most visceral metaphor she could find. Gateway drug. The pharmaceutical comparison wasn't accidental. Piotrkowski chose those words because they captured something essential about the dynamic, The idea that initial exposure creates dependency, that one experience leads inevitably to deeper engagement, that the substance itself transforms the user fundamentally. But gateway drugs have a secondary meaning that nobody on that Nashville stage wanted to acknowledge. They create tolerance. The high diminishes, and eventually, users need something stronger or they stop using entirely. The question hovering over women's basketball isn't whether Caitlin Clark brought new fans. She obviously did. The question is whether those fans came for basketball or for Caitlin Clark, and whether there's any meaningful difference between those two things when building sustainable league infrastructure. The data from summer 2024 provides uncomfortable answers. Clark's Fever games averaged over 1.6 million viewers during her healthy stretch of the season. Games without Clark averaged fewer than 700,000. That gap, nearly a million viewers per contest, represented not just preference but categorical separation. People weren't watching the WNBA with special interest in Clark. They were watching Clark and accepting the WNBA as the vehicle for that experience. When she went down with a leg injury in July, the natural experiment began. Every sports executive with access to overnight ratings data watched the numbers like epidemiologists tracking a virus. What happened next became the statistic nobody discusses honestly. Viewership dropped 31% in the immediate aftermath of Clark's injury. Not a gradual decline, a cliff. The audience that had flooded into women's basketball evaporated within days, leaving behind the core fanbase that had existed before her arrival plus a modest increment of retained newcomers. And yet Piotrkowski stood in Nashville and declared victory. Her argument went like this. ESPN still had its most-watched WNBA regular season ever. The playoffs drew record numbers. The overall season showed a 3% bump in viewership compared to the previous year. These facts are technically accurate and completely misleading. The most-watched regular season included months of Clark playing. Remove her games from the calculation and the remaining contests showed no meaningful growth over 2023. The playoff bump came from heightened awareness created during the regular season, residual attention from a story that had dominated sports media for 6 months. And that 3% improvement? It represented approximately 20,000 additional average viewers per game. In a country of 330 million people, the great women's basketball revolution delivered the population of a small suburban town. But here's where the analysis gets genuinely interesting. The Nashville panel included Rose Goldon-Yud, a broadcaster whose career spans both traditional networks and newer media platforms. Her contribution to the discussion revealed something that the ratings fixation obscures. Quality of coverage had fundamentally changed. Goldon-Yud pointed out that broadcasters now felt pressure to pronounce names correctly, to know biographical details, to treat athletes with the same preparation given to their male counterparts. She used Breanna Stewart as her example, one of the greatest players in WNBA history, a 2-time champion and finals MVP, whose name networks had mispronounced for years without consequence. Stewart's first name rhymes with banana. Announcers said it like fauna. Nobody cared because nobody was watching closely enough to notice. That changed when audiences swelled. Suddenly millions of viewers heard the mistakes, registered them, complained. The institutional sloppiness that had characterized women's sports coverage became visible, embarrassing, actionable. Networks responded by demanding better preparation, hiring consultants, implementing quality controls that had never existed. This infrastructure improvement represents genuine progress independent of any individual player. But Goldon-Yud's observation contained an uncomfortable implication that she didn't state explicitly. The quality improvement came as response to audience scrutiny. Without that audience, the pressure disappears. If Clark's viewers leave, if the gateway drug wears off without creating permanent users, the networks face a choice. They can maintain expensive production standards for smaller audiences, accepting the financial loss, or they can revert to the baseline treatment that preceded the boom, acknowledging that women's basketball doesn't merit premium investment. ESPN's Nashville programming announced their answer preemptively. Women's Sports Sundays would replace Sunday Night Baseball for 9 weeks, filling prime real estate with WNBA games and studio programming. Piotrkowski called it their Monday Night Football, a flagship franchise around which they would build programming identity. The ambition was unmistakable. So was the risk. Monday Night Football works because the NFL delivers consistent massive audiences regardless of which teams play. The matchup matters less than the product. The WNBA has never demonstrated that capability. Individual stars drive interest. Specific narratives capture attention. Without the right story, games revert to background noise. The women's sports Sunday gamble depends entirely on whether Clark-level interest can be manufactured for athletes who don't have Clark's cultural momentum. And that manufacturing process raises questions the league prefers to avoid. What made Caitlin Clark different? The standard answers involve skill, entertainment value, relatable personality. She shoots from deep. She has range that extends to the logo. Her passing vision creates highlights. She shows emotion on the court, trash talks opponents, displays competitive fire that casual fans recognize as authentic rather than performed. All true, all incomplete. Clark also arrived with structural advantages no previous WNBA star possessed. Her college career coincided with the implementation of name, image, and likeness rules, allowing her to monetize her popularity while still in school. She built a social media presence before going pro, establishing direct connection with millions of followers who would track her wherever she played. The Iowa women's basketball program had cultivated genuine regional passion, filling arenas with devoted fans who created atmosphere indistinguishable from major men's programs. She entered the league as a finished product commercially, not a prospect requiring development. More controversially, Clark benefited from demographic factors that shaped media coverage in ways the industry rarely acknowledges openly. She played at a predominantly white institution in a predominantly white state. Her appearance conformed to conventional beauty standards that American media has historically rewarded with disproportionate attention. Her personality translated easily to mainstream platforms without requiring audiences to confront discomfort about race, politics, or social position. Previous WNBA superstars had possessed comparable or superior basketball skills. None had possessed comparable cultural positioning. Maya Moore won 4 championships and 2 MVP awards before stepping away from the sport to pursue criminal justice reform. Diana Taurasi's statistical achievements exceed Clark's by every metric. Aya Wilson has won championships, MVPs, and Olympic gold while demonstrating charisma that captivates every room she enters. These players received coverage from sports media, but never broke into broader cultural conversation, the way Clark did during her final college season. The differential treatment became impossible to ignore, and impossible to discuss without invoking dynamics that make corporate sponsors nervous. When Clark joined the Fever, the tension surfaced immediately. Established WNBA players who had fought for years to gain recognition watched a rookie receive more attention in weeks than they had accumulated across entire careers. The response was complicated. Most players recognized that rising tides lift all boats, that Clark's presence generated attention benefiting everyone. But some frustration emerged, publicly and privately. Chandy Carter's hard foul on Clark during a June game became national news, dissected on programs that had never previously covered the WNBA. The discourse devolved rapidly. Was the foul excessive? Was Clark being protected? Was the reaction racialized? Were established players jealous of a newcomer? Were critics of the criticism dismissing legitimate concerns? Social media transformed a basketball play into a referendum on American identity. The league had wanted attention. This wasn't the kind they had imagined. But here's what the controversy revealed that matters more than any individual incident. The WNBA had entered a phase where every story contained multiple competing narratives, each with passionate constituencies, each generating engagement that algorithms rewarded and amplified. The sport had become content in ways it had never been before. Games mattered less than storylines. Performance statistics competed with social media metrics. The basketball itself, the actual product being sold, sometimes seemed secondary to the drama surrounding it. Piotrkowski addressed this indirectly in Nashville, when she said she wouldn't make newcomers feel silly for not understanding the sport. The admission was remarkable from an executive whose job involves promoting athletic excellence. She was acknowledging that many new viewers didn't comprehend what they were watching. They tuned in for phenomenon, not fundamentals. They wanted to see Clark because the internet told them Clark was important, not because they appreciated her court vision or understood spacing principles. and Piotrkowski's job was to convert that passive curiosity into genuine fandom before the phenomenon faded. The conversion process faces structural obstacles that enthusiasm alone cannot overcome. Basketball literacy takes time to develop. Understanding why a pass is exceptional requires recognizing what makes most passes ordinary. Appreciating defensive rotations demands baseline knowledge about positioning schemes. The WNBA plays a style of basketball that experts consider beautiful. More emphasis on ball movement, fewer isolation possessions, better spacing, more visible teamwork. But casual viewers often can't distinguish quality execution from average play. The entertainment product also differs from what most casual fans expect based on their NBA experience. WNBA athletes cannot dunk routinely. Fast breaks don't generate the same explosive highlights. The gap between WNBA and men's college basketball in terms of above-rim play creates uncomfortable comparisons that critics weaponize and defenders dismiss, but that shape casual perception regardless. None of this means the WNBA offers an inferior product. It means the product requires context that new viewers must choose to acquire. And in an attention economy where every entertainment option competes against infinite alternatives, that acquisition cost matters. Piotrkowski's gateway drug metaphor implicitly acknowledges the challenge. Initial exposure creates openness, but sustained engagement requires continued doses, reasons to keep watching, storylines that maintain investment, emotional stakes that translate across broadcasts. Clark provided those reasons automatically. Her mere presence generated narrative. Every game contained subtext. Would she score 30? Would opponents target her? Would she lead a comeback? Would the Fever finally win? The team's poor record during her rookie season actually helped sustain interest because it created ongoing drama. Winning cures storylines by providing resolution. Struggling extends them indefinitely. When Clark went down injured, the storyline machinery ground to a halt. The Fever continued playing, but the central character was absent. Viewers who had tuned in specifically for her chapter had no reason to continue reading. And this is where the most crucial question emerges, one that ESPN's Nashville panel carefully avoided addressing directly. Can the WNBA manufacture replacement narratives capable of generating equivalent audience commitment? History suggests the answer is complicated. The league has never lacked compelling individual stories. Breanna Ionescu's journey from losing Kobe Bryant, her mentor and friend, to winning championships with the Liberty provides dramatic material exceeding anything scripted television offers. Kelsey Plum's transformation from league outsider to champion and icon contradicts every assumption about what WNBA stardom looks like. Breanna Stewart rebuilt her career from an Achilles tear that might have ended it, becoming arguably the best player in the world through sheer determination and evolved skill. These narratives exist. They've always existed. They simply haven't captured mainstream attention at scale. The question is whether that failure reflects insufficient marketing, structural bias in media coverage, audience preferences that cannot be engineered away, or some combination all three. Piotrkowski's programming moves bet on the first explanation, that proper promotion and prominent placement can transform any compelling story into cultural event. The bet requires ignoring contrary evidence from decades of sports media history. Networks have promoted countless athletes as the next big thing. Most promotions fail despite substantial investment. The variables that determine breakthrough versus obscurity remain poorly understood, even by executives who study them obsessively. Lightning strikes where it strikes. Afterward, everyone claims they knew it would hit that exact spot. But nobody can direct lightning on command. The WNBA's business model now depends on directing lightning repeatedly, on finding or creating Clark-level cultural moments season after season, on convincing audiences that women's basketball deserves permanent appointment viewing rather than occasional curiosity visits. The infrastructure investments happening now assume success. Franchises are renovating arenas, expanding practice facilities, signing local television deals worth multiples of previous contracts. The league negotiated a new collective bargaining agreement that dramatically increased player salaries, with minimum compensation rising above $60,000 and maximum salaries approaching $700,000. These investments make sense if the audience growth proves durable. They become catastrophically expensive if viewership reverts to pre-Clark baselines. And nobody actually knows which scenario will materialize. The executives presenting at Nashville radiate confidence because projecting doubt would be professionally suicidal. Internally, they're watching the same numbers everyone else watches, and they understand how fragile the foundation remains. Consider what happens if Clark misses significant time next season. The Fever are currently building their entire organizational strategy around her presence. Marketing campaigns feature her face. Ticket sales assume her participation. Broadcast negotiations factored in her drawing power. An extended injury doesn't just hurt the team competitively. It threatens the financial projections underlying every business decision the franchise has made since drafting her. The league has no insurance policy against her absence because no insurance policy could capture the externality effects. Her injury doesn't just hurt Indiana. It affects every WNBA team's attendance when they host the Fever. It reduces national broadcast ratings that determine next year's advertising rates. It alters the conversation about women's sports in ways that ripple through endorsement markets, media coverage decisions, and corporate sponsorship calculations. One player's ligament bears the weight of an entire industry's aspirations. This concentration of dependency contradicts every principle of sound business construction. Diversification reduces risk. Redundancy protects against catastrophic failure. No competent financial advisor would recommend building a portfolio entirely around a single volatile asset. Yet the WNBA has done exactly that, not by choice but by necessity. Clark represents the only proven product market fit the league has ever achieved at scale. Betting against her would mean betting against their only demonstrated path to mainstream relevance. So they double down, hoping the cards keep falling favorably, while knowing the odds eventually turn. The Nashville panel included one more participant whose presence illustrated the broader ecosystem dynamics at play. Nancy Dubuque serves as executive chair of Together, a media company founded by female athletes including Alex Morgan, Chloe Kim, Simone Manuel, and Sue Bird. Together represents a newer model for women's sports coverage, athlete-owned, digitally native, designed specifically to serve audiences that traditional networks underserved. Dubuque's participation signaled that the women's sports conversation now involves power centers beyond legacy media. Athletes themselves are building infrastructure to control their narratives rather than depending on networks whose commitment might waver when ratings dip. This decentralization matters because it creates alternative paths for audience development. If ESPN reduces women's basketball coverage, when not if their programming priorities shift to the next shiny object, athlete-owned platforms can maintain engagement with dedicated fans. The floor drops less far when communities exist independently of broadcast schedules. But Together and its equivalents can't replace ESPN's reach. They serve different functions in the attention economy. Legacy networks provide discovery, the chance encounter that turns a non-viewer into a curious browser into a committed fan. Digital platforms provide depth, the ongoing engagement that transforms casual interest into identity-level connection. The gateway drug metaphor applies here too. ESPN introduces new users. Platforms like Together manage their ongoing experience. The system works only if both components function simultaneously. The current moment represents unprecedented coordination between these components. ESPN is promoting heavily. Digital platforms are capturing converted audiences. Athletes are building personal brands that transcend team affiliations. Everything aligns in ways that should produce durable growth. Yet the underlying mathematics remain concerning. The WNBA's total audience, even at peak Caitlin Clark interest, represents a fraction of what major men's leagues achieve routinely. The league's most watched regular season game drew approximately 2.4 million viewers. The average NFL regular season game draws over 16 million. The gap isn't closing. It's simply shrinking from astronomical to merely vast. Piotrkowski's programming philosophy accepts this reality implicitly. When she describes women's sports as needing their own franchise night, she's acknowledging that the audience composition differs fundamentally from men's sports viewership. Women's Sports Sunday won't compete with Sunday Night Football in raw numbers. It will compete for a different audience. Viewers who want that specific product and will reliably tune in regardless of matchup, plus casual browsers who might discover new favorites through prime placement. This strategy makes sense if the core audience is large enough to justify premium production costs. The WNBA is betting that dedicated fans plus retained newcomers plus steady organic growth eventually reaches sustainable scale. The timeline for that reach stretches across years, possibly a decade. Patience is required from corporate parents accustomed to quarterly earnings pressures. Whether that patience materializes depends on factors entirely beyond basketball. ESPN's parent company Disney faces activist investor pressure demanding improved profitability. Sports rights inflation has squeezed broadcast margins across the industry. The streaming transition has disrupted advertising models that traditional networks depend upon. In this environment, women's sports occupy a strange position: theoretically valuable as growth sector, practically vulnerable as underperforming asset. An executive can believe in women's basketball's future while cutting its budget to meet short-term targets. Those contradictory positions coexist in corporate decision-making constantly. The Nashville event where Piotrkowski spoke was organized by Front Office Sports, a trade publication focused on the business of athletics. The audience consisted primarily of industry insiders, executives, agents, marketers, consultants who profit from sports transactions. Their enthusiasm for women's sports reflects genuine belief and calculated self-interest in roughly equal measure. They want the market to grow because growth creates opportunities for their services. They want the narrative to be optimistic because optimism attracts investment that funds their salaries. This doesn't mean their optimism is wrong. It means their optimism should be understood contextually. The people most loudly proclaiming women's sports' inevitable rise are precisely the people who benefit most from that rise occurring. Disinterested analysis would weigh positive indicators against concerning trends without predetermined conclusions. Instead, the discourse treats skepticism as hostility and doubt as oppression. Caitlin Clark's injury absence provided the clearest possible test case for evaluating the league's standalone appeal. The results were ambiguous enough that both optimists and pessimists could claim vindication. Viewership dropped substantially, supporting the argument that Clark specifically drove interest. But viewership remained elevated compared to pre-Clark baselines, supporting the argument that some conversion had occurred. The glass was simultaneously half full and half empty depending on which measuring stick you preferred. Piotrkowski chose to emphasize the half-full interpretation because her job requires projecting confidence. Skeptics chose to emphasize the half-empty interpretation because their platforms reward contrarianism. Neither side acknowledged the genuine uncertainty that honest analysis would require. The most intellectually honest position recognizes that the WNBA's future remains unwritten, contingent on variables nobody can predict or control. Will another player emerge with Clark-level cultural resonance? Will the audience that sampled the product during her rookie season return when she's healthy? Will competitor entertainment options fragment attention further, making it harder for any sport to maintain consistent viewership? Will economic conditions affect discretionary spending on tickets and merchandise? Will the political environment shape coverage in ways that attract or repel potential viewers? These questions don't have answers yet. They will only be answered by events that haven't occurred. Anyone claiming certainty about outcomes is selling something, usually their own importance as prognosticator. Goldan Yud's comments about broadcast quality touched something important that got buried in the coverage of Piotrkowski's more provocative remarks. She noted that increased scrutiny had exposed sloppiness in how networks covered women's athletes. Mispronounced names weren't isolated incidents but symptoms of systemic underinvestment in preparation. Announcers who would never butcher an NBA player's pronunciation routinely stumbled over WNBA players because the consequences for mistakes had historically been negligible. That's changing, not because networks suddenly develop conscience but because audiences now notice and complain. The improvement is real but fragile. If audiences shrink, so does the accountability that drives quality. This dynamic applies across every aspect of women's sports coverage. Better camera work, more sophisticated graphics, deeper statistical analysis, more knowledgeable commentary. All these improvements emerged in response to audience growth and will recede if that growth reverses. The infrastructure isn't permanent. It's provisional, contingent on continued commercial justification. The WNBA has perhaps 2 or 3 seasons to prove that the elevated standard is sustainable before corporate patience expires. Clark's return to full health next season represents the most important variable in that calculation. Her presence guarantees certain baseline numbers. Her absence introduces uncertainty that sponsors and advertisers hate. The Fever's medical staff faces pressure that no professional sports organization should place on physical therapists and trainers. Her rehabilitation timeline becomes business news, reported and analyzed by financial journalists who don't normally cover basketball. This concentration of significance on one player's body crystallizes everything dysfunctional about how women's sports have developed in America. A league that should be showcasing depth instead showcases dependency. A sport with hundreds of elite practitioners instead relies on a single practitioner for commercial viability. But the players themselves understand this dynamic better than external observers. Established WNBA stars have watched cycles of hype and disappointment for years. They've seen previous saviors, players who would finally bring mainstream attention, fail to sustain interest through no fault of their own. They've experienced the frustration of excellence unrecognized and mediocrity rewarded, based on factors having nothing to do with basketball performance. Many have made peace with the structural unfairness through focus on process. Play well, develop younger players, build team culture, trust that eventually quality gets recognized. The Stoic philosophy embedded in WNBA locker rooms would impress ancient Greek philosophers. This resilience represents perhaps the league's most undervalued asset. The athletes have been conditioned by adversity to perform without external validation. They play at elite levels for salaries that would embarrass mid-level corporate managers. They spend off-seasons playing overseas because domestic compensation doesn't support year-round living. They handle equipment shortages, travel indignities, and media disinterest with professionalism that their better-resourced male counterparts might not maintain under similar circumstances. The contrast became explicit during debates about working conditions that followed Clark's arrival. New viewers accustomed to NBA-level production learned that WNBA teams fly commercial rather than charter. They learned about hotels that would violate player union agreements in men's leagues. They learned about practice facilities shared with local recreation programs. The revelations generated outrage that players had expressed for years without anyone listening. Suddenly their complaints gained amplification because the audience had grown large enough to create pressure. Again, the improvement came not from moral awakening, but from commercial incentive. Networks and sponsors didn't want their product associated with embarrassing treatment of athletes they were simultaneously promoting as stars. The new collective bargaining agreement addressed some concerns. Charter flights became standard for certain situations. Salary floors rose meaningfully, but the improvements remained partial, contingent on continued revenue growth that might or might not materialize. Players accepted the deal knowing it was better than alternatives, while falling short of parity with male counterparts. They've spent careers making that calculation, taking what's available while advocating for what's deserved, managing expectations while refusing to abandon ambition. Aya Wilson embodies this balance as clearly as any player in the league. She won the MVP award in 2020 and again in 2022, establishing herself as the most dominant player in women's basketball. Her championship with the Las Vegas Aces in 2022 and 2023 demonstrated that excellence could translate into team success. Her Olympic gold medals added international credentials to her domestic achievements. By every basketball metric, she stands among the greatest players in WNBA history. Yet Wilson's fame never approached Clark's cultural footprint despite comparable or superior on-court production. The disparity generated commentary that often descended into unproductive recrimination. Some argued Wilson's blackness explained the differential attention in ways that indicted American society. Others argued Clark's playing style generated more highlights in ways that reflected legitimate entertainment preferences. Others argued college basketball's reach explained why Clark arrived with larger following. All positions contained partial truth without fully explaining the phenomenon. The honest answer is probably that multiple factors combined in ways that cannot be disentangled, that Clark benefited from some combination of timing, circumstance, appearance, location, personality, playing style, and luck in proportions nobody can precisely calculate. Wilson herself handled the comparison with remarkable grace. She welcomed Clark to the league, praised her abilities, and focused on her own game rather than litigating fairness. Her professionalism contrasted with the pettiness that social media discourse sometimes projected onto her. She had spent enough years in the league to understand that attention cycles pass, that sustained excellence outlasts temporary phenomenon, that legacy is written across careers rather than seasons. But even Wilson's equanimity revealed something important about the psychological demands placed on WNBA athletes. They must perform at world-class levels while managing external narratives that question their value relative to newer, more culturally convenient competitors. They must celebrate the league's growth while acknowledging that growth concentrates benefits unequally. They must be team players on courts where individual stardom determines most commercial outcomes. The upcoming season will test whether the league learned anything from the Caitlin Clark experience. Draft prospects entering the 2025 class include players with their own cultural followings, their own social media presence, their own potential to generate crossover interest. Whether networks and franchises can identify and cultivate those prospects before they emerge represents a new competency that the league must develop. The reactive approach, waiting for lightning to strike and then rushing to monetize it, cannot sustain long-term growth. Proactive audience development requires identifying future stars, building narratives around them, creating anticipation before arrival, rather than scrambling to capture attention after the fact. ESPN's Women's Sports Sunday initiative represents exactly this kind of proactive investment. By establishing appointment viewing infrastructure before specific matchups justify it, the network creates conditions that might generate unexpected breakout moments. A regular viewer tuning in for one game might discover an unfamiliar player whose style resonates. Social media clips from consistent programming might accumulate algorithmic momentum. The compounding effects of sustained visibility might produce results that sporadic coverage cannot achieve. Or the entire initiative might fade after 9 weeks when Sunday Night Baseball returns and women's sports lose their prime real estate. Piotrkowski acknowledged the impermanence directly in Nashville when she described the programming block as intentional franchise building. The language itself revealed the fragility. You don't describe something as franchise building if the franchise already exists securely. You use that language when you're trying to will something into existence through repetition and investment, hoping that if you call it a franchise loudly enough it becomes one. The performative confidence masked genuine uncertainty about whether audiences would materialize in sufficient numbers to justify permanent commitment. Meanwhile, Clark continues her rehabilitation, posting occasional social media updates that generate more engagement than most players' game highlights. Her absence has itself become content, analyzed and discussed in ways that keep her relevant without requiring her to play. The parasocial relationship between Clark and her audience functions independently of basketball performance. Fans feel invested in her recovery, her future, her happiness in ways that transcend athletic appreciation. When she returns, assuming she returns fully healthy, the audience will greet her with pent-up emotional energy that could generate viewership spikes exceeding even her rookie season numbers. That hypothetical return represents the best-case scenario for everyone invested in women's basketball's growth. Clark healthy and performing at peak ability, surrounded by improved fever teammates, competing against upgraded competition, with narrative stakes elevated by her absence and return. The storylines practically write themselves. The comeback athlete, the team transformed, the league's biggest star reclaiming her throne. Television executives dream about such scenarios because they require no marketing creativity. The audience arrives pre-invested, seeking emotional payoff for attention they've already committed. But best-case scenarios require everything to break favorably. Bodies must cooperate. Opponents must provide worthy resistance without actually derailing the protagonist's arc. External events must not distract national attention. The timing of other sports calendars must create windows for WNBA visibility, rather than competition for eyeballs. So many variables must align that counting on optimal outcomes represents planning failure, rather than strategic confidence. The WNBA's actual position is precarious despite the optimistic framing from Nashville stages. The league experienced genuine growth in 2024, generated genuine new interest, achieved genuine mainstream moments. But that growth remains concentrated in ways that healthy organizations would diversify. The interest depends on players who might get injured or retire or simply stop capturing cultural imagination. The moments require manufacturing conditions that can't be reliably reproduced. Piotrkowski's gateway drug metaphor contains one more implication she probably didn't intend. Gateway drugs are illegal. They represent substances that society has decided are dangerous enough to prohibit despite some users managing them without apparent harm. The metaphor suggests that women's sports' current growth model carries risks that responsible stewardship would mitigate. The concentration of audience dependency on individual stars, the vulnerability to injury disruption, the conflation of celebrity interest with genuine sports fandom, the structural inequities that make breakthrough contingent on factors unrelated to athletic excellence. These aren't features of a healthy product. They're symptoms of a market still developing basic functionality. The next 18 months will determine whether the WNBA has built something durable or simply experienced a temporary spike that will be studied as cautionary tale. Clark returns. The audience either returns with her or doesn't. The league either develops additional stars capable of generating independent interest or remains dependent on her singular presence. The infrastructure investments either justify themselves through sustained revenue or become embarrassing overreach that forces painful contraction. Everything narrows now. The season approaches. The games will be played. The numbers will tell the truth that press conferences obscure. Piotrkowski will stand on future stages declaring success if success materializes, or she'll be replaced by executives tasked with managing decline if decline arrives instead. The athletes will perform regardless because performance is what they've always done. Excellence for its own sake, recognition or no recognition, legacy or obscurity. What the Nashville panel demonstrated more clearly than any participant intended was how little the people running women's sports actually control. They can program prime slots. They can invest in production quality. They can craft narratives and deploy marketing. But they cannot make audiences care. They cannot manufacture cultural moments. They cannot guarantee that the next Caitlin Clark will emerge, or that the current one will remain healthy, or that interest will sustain through inevitable setbacks and disappointments. The honest version of Piotrkowski's statement wouldn't compare Clark to drugs. It would compare her to weather, a natural phenomenon that arrived unexpectedly, transformed conditions briefly, and might never repeat regardless of how badly everyone wants it to. The WNBA didn't create Caitlin Clark. It inherited her. And inheritance creates obligations that the inheritor doesn't always know how to fulfill. The story everyone wants to tell is about women's basketball finally getting its due. The story that's actually unfolding is about an industry gambling everything on conditions it cannot control, hoping that luck continues favoring the bold. Whether that gamble pays off isn't a matter of will or strategy or even quality of product. It's a matter of forces no executive understands well enough to predict. And somewhere in Indiana, a player rehabilitates her injury, posts updates to millions of followers, and carries on her shoulders the weight of every expectation that women's sports has accumulated across decades of struggle and dismissal. She didn't ask for that weight. She simply arrived at the moment when everyone decided she was the one who should carry it. What happens next will be called inevitable in retrospect, obvious in hindsight, predictable by anyone paying attention. But right now, nobody knows. That uncertainty is the only honest thing anyone in Nashville should have said.